Nigel in particular too often says things which are too inflaming to certain sensitivities.
By calling an early election, Government Minister and arch Brexiteer Steve Baker had a dilemma. Suddenly he had an election to fight in his marginal seat in Wickham, but he also had a holiday booked in sunny Greece. His answer was refreshingly honest. The election could wait. He was off to Greece. Some things, he said, are more important than winning an election. Well, now he's back, tanned, and on Times Radio. Steve Baker, welcome to the programme. Let's start right away. Let's get your reaction to the news about these two Tory candidates now losing the party's support.
Well, Andrew, could I first say that I did do quite a lot of work in Greece. I did all the work that was necessary. I had the support of my chairman and my activists as I went. And of course, my campaign started a year ago and rests on 14 years of serving Wickham. So I hope you will forgive that I kept promises to my wife and some friends. But of course, this is the right decision. I can't comment on internal Conservative Party processes. And of course, the Gambling Commission is independent. And I understand they have asked that we not give a rolling commentary. So with that in mind, I can't really comment on how the Conservative parties reached this decision.
All right. Well, I won't ask you in the process if you don't want to answer that. But let me put a broader point to you. For a lot of people, it feels emblematic of a party that's reached ancien regime status, does it not? A certain decadence, a self-indulgence has set in now.
Well, that I'm afraid is right. It looks terrible. I don't think anyone's denying that. I'm very clear in public life that a couple of things. First, the public deserve to know that we hold ourselves to a higher standard than we hold anyone else. And also, of course, if war is a continuation of politics by other means, an very old saying, we should remember that politics is war minus a shooting, and one should never expose a flank. So whether for political reasons or just out of sheer respect for the public, we should maintain very high standards and stick to them. And just the implication or the impression that somebody might have placed a bet on inside knowledge is totally unacceptable. So political betting will go on, but I'm very clear that it can't be a bet on something where people are involved in the decision, because that, of course, means they've taken all element of chance out. It's just obvious that standard needs to be upheld.
When did you get wind that July the 4th would be election day?
When the Prime Minister announced it.
You had no advance warning or indications?
No, I expected an election in November. I was, in fact, it's one of the reasons I went on holiday. So I was sprinting to implement safeguarding the union and the Windsor framework, and that's partly why I needed a break, because I was timing all of this to get ready for a November election. So yeah, it was a complete surprise to me, but thankfully I had a campaign manager in place already, and took that week to write the copy and get the leaflets ready and prepare the social media campaigns. And I'm pleased to say that at the moment my campaign, by some measures that the party uses, is one of the highest performing in Thames Valley and in the country. So I'm very pleased with how we're doing.
Obviously, we can't talk too much about your constituency in the middle of an election campaign. No. But do you think it wise of Rishi Sunak to have gone early rather than wait till November?
Well, at the moment, with the campaign having gone as badly as it has, that's the context through which anyone might view this timing decision. But I don't know what factors were in his mind. He didn't consult me. I had no idea that he was going to go for it. But who knows how the future might have worked out. But it would have been pretty extraordinary if we had won a fifth successive general election. I mean, that I think would have been unprecedented, but I could be corrected. But it would have been extraordinary. But to be doing as badly in the polls as we are at the moment is, of course, extremely worrying. I think for 14 years of experience, I know that Parliament really does need some balance. If governments aren't well scrutinised, they'll do all sorts of things. So, it will be pretty bad for this country if the Labour Party has a majority of 250. I think they could be in power for a generation if that happens. And obviously, as a Conservative of a classical Liberal persuasion, I think that would be extremely bad for us all.
But it sounds from what you're saying that you think, you don't want it to happen, but you think that is the way it's going.
Well, we can all see the polls. I mean, I have to say, in my constituency, knocking on doors, I can see that we're much closer than the polls suggest. I think that there's a possibility that I could win. But until the votes are cast and counted, we don't know. But when I knock on doors, the public aren't telling me, well, rather Conservative voters are not telling me they want a Labour government. They're not really telling me that they want to defect to reform. What they're saying is they'd like a better Conservative government. And to me, a better Conservative government is one that believes in freedom under the rule of law, accountable parliamentary democracy, and of course, pragmatism. So, I think that's what the party's got to stand for. I've long believed that if the Conservative
Does it
Party
not stand for these
does not
things at the
stand for
moment?
freedom, well, it's difficult. And as I've said, I'm afraid was in the news, it's difficult for me to, for example, reconcile national service with a fundamental belief in freedom. So, to me, if we don't stand for freedom, we stand for nothing. And I really want to make sure that we're a party with a really solid intellectual keel on the ship of state, all the while we're being pragmatic. As an engineer, to care about good ideas whilst being pragmatic is perfectly natural. I think that's how politics should work.
I understand. Now, you are a Conservative minister, you're a Conservative candidate in this election. If you were neither of these things, but you held the same views as you hold, that you have just given us a summary of, would you be tempted to vote for reform?
No, I'd always vote Conservative. I was reflecting after one of the debates that were I not a candidate, I probably wouldn't have watched the debate, so I'd simply vote Conservative on the day. I'm very, very clear that one of the biggest problems in politics is non-participation. And unfortunately, people, particularly of a free market orientation, tend to walk away when they're not getting what they want. But unfortunately, politics and the free market are two different categories of action. And if people walk away from the Conservative Party, they're walking away from the best hope we have of good government, a good government that does believe in freedom. So no, I would not be tempted. I'm absolutely clear that I would stick with the Conservative Party.
People think we've had anything but good government. Even people who voted for you in 2019, they think we've had anything but good government in recent years. We've had chaotic government.
Well, I deeply regret that the last 8 years has been as difficult as they have been. Of course, I think it's worth saying we had 5 years of coalition where the Lib Dems practically held equal power through the Quad. Cabinet ministers couldn't get anything done unless a policy had been through the Quad equally with the Lib Dems. We then had a small majority, but we had to hold the referendum because that was a pledge that had been made. Everything then happened. I've just read Tim Shipman's book, but relived the events.
Which I mentioned.
That I was, yes, you did, and I listened very carefully. But yes, that was a miserable time in politics, and I'm clear why. But then, of course, as you said, COVID hit us, and it's not just political capacity, it's state capacity. And I really enjoy working with officials. If, as a minister, you know what you want and you know the intellectual underpinnings for what you want and you're willing to make choices and prioritise, then working with officials can be extremely satisfying. And if I say so myself, satisfying all round, because you can actually work as professionals together and deliver. But what I do recognise is that official capacity will have been completely consumed by Brexit and then completely consumed by COVID.
But part of the reform, Nigel Farage critique of the Conservative Party is that it isn't really Conservative anymore. It was a big government, Conservative government, believes in big government under Mr. Johnson. It's a technocratic government under Mr. Sunak. I mean, it must cross your mind. I mean, some of what you're saying almost implies that this isn't a very Conservative government.
Well, any political party is a broad church, and we can see that with the Labour Party. They've just had this big experiment on the hard left with Jeremy Corbyn. Now, as I've said, they're manoeuvring to the right, free market right of Liz Truss on housing and on healthcare. So, every political party is a broad church. The Conservative Party is a broad church. And, I've worked with all wings of the party on different issues. And we are a broad church, but we're at our best when we're resolute around our central values of freedom and responsibility, private enterprise, and in the small platoons that bring us together as a community and as a nation. And it's true at this particular juncture in time. State spending is extremely high. There's a lot of regulation. We're still working through what it means to have left the EU. There's been great success, which has set out in Kemi Badenoch's 4-year review. But clearly there's more to be done.
Steve Baker, this week marks the 8th anniversary of the 2016 referendum. Do you now accept that even some Brexit voters, maybe quite a lot of Brexit voters, are now wondering if it really was worth the candle?
It's bound to be the case that people on each side of the argument will have changed their views, and some will have hardened their views. But I have to say, I was in a very Remain area of my constituency recently, and a gentleman told me he voted Remain and now is wishing that he'd voted Leave and is glad that we're out. So opinions will vary. But if I may, some of this is OTOs, because I of course, through being a cabinet office minister doing safeguarding the union, I worked closely with senior EU officials, and I said to one in my last meeting, people are worried about the Labour Party salami slicing their way back into the EU. And he immediately, heartily laughed, very naturally. They don't want us changing the basis of this relationship. And I'm very clear that once we decided to leave the legal structures of the European Union, that meant a free trade agreement, not a customs union, not the EEA, and certainly not both. It couldn't have been Theresa May's deal. It always meant a free trade agreement with special arrangements for Northern Ireland. I put a lot of work into what those arrangements should be. I've said publicly, including at the dispatch box, that the Northern Ireland arrangements are a hard compromise for unionists and Eurosceptics. I would have liked us to have done better, but this is where we are. And as Bismarck said, politics is the art of the possible, the art of the second best. And I do think we have to be pragmatic. But what we can't be doing is going back once again to unpick an agreement that's taken 8 years to enter into. I think the EU will laugh the Labour Party out of the negotiating room.
I understand that, but that's not what I'm asking you. Really what I'm saying is you must be disappointed. Even with second best, you must be disappointed that Brexit has not started a radical transformation of Britain and shows no sign of doing so.
No, I'm not really. I mean, because I think in your analysis, you were very clear about COVID having interrupted progress. And, Boris and his plans for levelling up were very big state. I mean, that is, of course, the government's policy. But, Boris and indeed Dominic Cummings wanted to pump prime the UK with a lot of spending on science and on levelling up through infrastructure. That was their plan to kickstart us. And all of that went by the board as we hit COVID. So I think I'm realistic, but I would encourage anyone to Google the 4-year Brexit review, which Kemi Badenoch put out. It's very good and sets out some of the things that we've done, but some of those things will take time to come to fruition. So in the short run, banning the live export of animals is very popular with a great many people who I represent. Simple thing, never going to be enough to justify Brexit to those who remain.
No.
Unreconciled to it. But equally, joining the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership is a major geopolitical move. It means we've created a platform for free trade for the world, for high standards nations around the world with our accession, which means we can have free trade without political integration. And I think when you look at people in Europe moving to the far right, that plainly the EU is not working for them. And I think the world is going to need to move to a way for the maritime democracies to stand off peacefully against the Eurasian authoritarians. And CPTPP is going to be really important and transformational. So I'm afraid it's going to take time, but I am not disappointed, no.
Well, except that rather than Singapore on Thames, which is what some on your side of the argument said we could look forward to, and we know how prosperous and successful Singapore is, rather than anything like that, since we voted to leave the EU, we've become more like the EU under your government. The tax burden has moved towards European levels. The scale of public spending has moved towards European levels. Even the scope of regulation has stayed at European levels. What was the point?
Well, I'm very clear that about tax in particular, why spending is as high as it is. It's demographics, it's the cost of COVID. These are the things which are crystallizing now. And in particular, I'm afraid, if you look forward at the Office for Budget Responsibility's fiscal sustainability report, by this time people were tuning out. But unfortunately, that shows that in our lifetime, debt is going to reach hundreds of percent of GDP. That the audit of the National Insurance Fund shows it exhausted by 2043-4. That matters. Although it's like a current account through which money washes, it still needs to be in positive territory. We've got a huge problem working out all the way around the world right now. Government does too much and too often does it too badly.
Brexit's irrelevant. I mean, you have to face this whether we were in or out of the EU.
Well, that is absolutely true. Of course it is. But what I want to see is us being much more focused on spending money to enhance well-being. Look, if one were to go back to the 2009 Breakdown Britain report from the CSJ, one would find that even with the benefit of a massive credit boom, which made Labour think that boom and bust had been abolished, the welfare state still wasn't very effective, not as effective as it should have been back then. And the truth is, we've got a welfare state which doesn't work as well as we would like, and we can't afford it. And we are going to have to, in our lifetimes, come to a conclusion that the state should confine itself to what it must do, what it needs to do, and stop doing things which would be better left to the private sector. Now, unfortunately, the Labour Party, for all their positioning to the right of trusts, they, I think, believe in something called the entrepreneurial state, which is just socialism by another name. I think they're going to try and reinvent the state to endlessly intervene in our lives to try and get growth. That will be a disaster. Now,
let me bring you back to the Tory party. We'll see what Labour does if and when the result goes the way we think it is on July the 4th. There'll be plenty of time to analyse the direction they're going in. What I want to ask you is, did Brexit plus COVID, did that combination, did it break the Tory party? Didn't it divide it, exhaust it, divert it, overburden it in the end? And that's why you're in the mess you're in now?
Well, I think that on top of that, one has to look at the role of social media. I mean, the communications technology available to everyone, but in particular in use amongst members of parliament, is totally transformed since 2010. I mean, when I was first organising Conservatives for Britain in 2015, we used email and text messages. Now nobody would think of using anything other than WhatsApp. And so communication has become instantaneous amongst very large numbers of politicians. And Twitter, X, allows them to put their views out there in public again instantly. So once they've said something, they'll stand by it. The combination of organising by WhatsApp and making on-the-hoof public statements can be an extremely destabilising factor. So I think any historian would know that human nature's not changed much, particularly around politicians, for hundreds of years. But what now we have is this great acceleration which robs people of sensible decision-making time. And so that is going to be destabilising. And I think those sorts of features will contribute to tumult in North America and in Europe, as well as in the UK. So, yeah, of course, for any party in power through COVID, that will have been a terrific strain on any politician, any official system. And of course, it's been very difficult. But I am convinced that the Conservative Party can unite across all of the wings that we have in Parliament and come back in 5 years.
Well, let me ask you about that. Two final questions for you, and I'm grateful for your time in the middle of an election campaign too. There will probably be a battle royal for the soul of the Tory party after this election. Will you still have the stomach to be part of that fray?
Well, that's why I'm standing. I mean, I've said to numerous people on their doorstep that I would love, that I recognise things have gone wrong, and that I would love to have the opportunity to rise to their expectations of giving them the Conservative Party and the Conservative government which they expect. Pragmatic, professional, and yet principled, facing the challenges which are actually before us, but doing it in a fuss-free way. That's what I want to rise to.
And even if you lose, will you still be up for the battle for the soul of the Tory party?
I wouldn't like to say what I'll do if I lose. I think famously I've said I'll have a long break. It's been a long 14 years, as I've said in public. I think I would at least have the rest of the summer off if I lose the seat. But quite honestly, I want to win, and I am fighting this campaign to win because I would like very much to have the chance to sort this mess out. As perhaps I hope your listeners, though they may disagree with me, can hear. I think I've got a fairly firm grasp on the big patterns at work, and I want to deal with them.
So that's why I want to ask you this question, because it's clear you have an idea of the direction the Conservative Party, your party, should be going in. I get that. But how should a post-election Conservative Party handle Nigel Farage and reform? Would the Tories be at risk of a hostile takeover or a forced merger? Should they welcome either? What's your view?
No, I mean, the biggest problem in politics is lack of participation. So if the public want a good Conservative Party, please join the Conservative Party. Reform does not have a big base across the country. It's overwhelmingly led and driven by a tiny number of individuals. And unfortunately, Nigel in particular too often says things which are too inflaming to certain sensitivities. And he should be more careful with how he deals with issues. And I don't want to work with him. I don't. And I know some colleagues want to welcome him in, but in the diverse country that we have today, and particularly in a diverse community like the one that I represent, one must understand how one will be heard when talking about sensitive issues. And I'm afraid Nigel just doesn't just does not illustrate his capacity to do that. And so for that reason, I would not want him within the Conservative Party. We've got
All
to be
right.
people who very thoughtfully and temperately think about how we're heard by everyone we represent.
All right, Steve Baker, that's clear enough. Thank you for that. And thank you for joining me today from, I must say, a beautiful location there behind you. Thank you very much. Steve Baker there from his constituency. Constituency is at Wickham. He's fighting that for re-election. Let me give you the full candidate list for Wickham. It's Khalil Ahmed, the Workers' Party of Britain. Steve Baker, of course, Conservative. Tony Brodell, Liberal Democrat. Ed Gemmell, the Climate Party. Richard Phoenix, Reform UK. Ajaz Rahman, Independent. Emma Reynolds, Labour. Mark Smallwood, Independent. That's all those vying for your vote in Wickham.